Sorry.
Yeah, welcome for yet another episode. And today's guest is Mr. Marc Faber. He's a renowned and well-sought economist, and he's originally from Switzerland. He's the author and publisher of the best and well-known investment newsletter, the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report. He's also known as Mr. Doom. So welcome so much, Mr. Faber, and I'm very grateful that you've been so gracious with your time. So to begin our session, I'm just going to ask you the question: what risks do you see in the global economy and the financial markets currently?
Well, I think to answer the question, I would require a whole day, because there are risks on every level. There are social risks, there are economic risks, there are financial risks, and there are geopolitical risks, and there are health risks. So, the list is endless. On the other hand, as you know, our world, let's say our recorded history is maybe 5,000 years old, and we've overcome many crises, and some crises led to improvements, and some led to calamity, with civilizations essentially vanishing, like the Mayan civilization, and so forth. So if the question is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the risks compared to the reward? It depends about what, because stocks in the world in general are not particularly cheap. They are inexpensive in some selected markets. In Latin America, we find cheap valuations, and in some of the Asian markets, there are inexpensive valuations. And maybe in some sectors in Europe, and also even in the US, because some US stocks have gone up a lot, but this is a handful of stocks, the FANG and FANG-related stocks, while others have been languishing. So let's say financial stocks maybe on the high end. On the other hand, the mining stocks are relatively inexpensive. Or if you look at the gold mining sector, everything that is South African is very depressed, whereas, say, American or Canadian gold mines are not that depressed. So we have to take an approach by asset class. There's some real estate that is expensive, and then you can go to Portugal, Spain, Italy, even in Switzerland. There are villages where they give you the house essentially free of charge if you then redo it, if you remodel it. So I think there are considerable risks in the world, and that financial asset prices are still relatively high. I don't expect that you will make a lot of money out of financial assets, but it doesn't mean that, like a lottery, someone will win the lottery each time, but not many people. So my view is that if you want to really make money in this market, in this environment of many, many different risks, you will have to take significant risks. In other words, you have to focus on one depressed group and hope that it will turn around and move up.
Oh, thank you so much. My previous guests on this platform, Michael Pinto and Axel Marker, involved in the gold aspect. You've just mentioned the gold and geopolitics. So do you think that geopolitics will play a most significant role in the pricing of gold moving forward? So could we have a situation where maybe gold is over 2,500 USDs?
I don't know where the price will go of gold, whether it will go up right away or not. There are two or three factors that I want to mention, or issues related to gold. First of all, gold as a commodity is not that cheap. There are agricultural commodities that are much cheaper relative to gold that I would, if I were to wanted to make a lot of money, I would go into some depressed commodities like the agricultural. Number two, say if you compare platinum and silver to gold, then platinum and silver are relatively inexpensive. But I have been telling people for the last 40 years that they shouldn't trust central banks and they shouldn't trust governments. That is an important lesson for life. Never trust any government, because the government officials, the bureaucrats, they want to stay in power and they will do anything to stay in power. A lot of them are pathologically sick and they want to essentially, they're not interested in defending the interest of the ordinary citizen. They're interested in protecting their own interests. And so don't ever believe any government, what they say and what they ask you to do. We've seen this with COVID, the lies that they dished. And my view would be, if you want to be a free man, if you want to protect yourself, to hold some gold is a safe asset in the long run. Now, it could be that if you buy gold today at around 2020, that it drops to 1800 and doesn't recover for many years. It's possible. But I think that in an environment such as we had in the last 100 years, where the government has printed more and more money, we can follow these statistics by looking at the monetary mass or the monetary aggregates or the balance sheet of central banks. In this environment where electronically they can print money, I want to hold some physical precious metals, gold, silver, platinum. I don't know where the price will go, but I'm just saying as a safe asset. Now, then you ask me, Mark, what is safe? That is a good question, because, if the governments could lock you in and tell you can't go out in front of your house in your own garden and smoke, then maybe one day they will take your gold away. That is a possibility. That is a possibility. They can take everything away through taxes. They can tax your house. They can tax your salary. The governments will do everything, as I said, in their own interest. So there is a risk to hold gold. But you can lower the risk by holding gold, say you're in the UK or in America, by holding it in another country.
Okay.
Maybe it's safer to hold gold in Moscow in a vault than in the US. I don't know. It's something to think about.
Thank you for that. You acknowledge that we live in a very, very volatile world. And you have been a critic of mainstream economic theories. You yourself are a known contrarian. What alternative approaches or theories to economics would you advocate for? And how would that inform your investment? How has that informed your investment strategies over the last 4 decades?
Let's say, if we look at economics, we have to distinguish, I'm pursuing policy and regulations that maximize economic growth, or I am interested in redistributing wealth. Say, if I see a forest, the tall trees and small trees and bushes and flowers and so forth, do I want to cut the tall trees and make everything equal? That is socialism and communism. Or do I want to lift everyone up, whereby some will go higher than others? Do you understand? The capitalistic system is the only system that we had in the last 5,000 years, which has lifted everyone out of poverty. And if a socialist comes to me and says, How can you say such a thing? How can you prove it? I can prove it. I can tell people, go to China 40 years ago in 1980 when it was dirt poor, and look at it today. Go to India 25 years ago and look at it today. All these countries, go to Vietnam. I've seen it all. I've seen also Russia, they were dirt poor in 1980 when I first went there. They were lining up at markets in lines to buy rotten apples. Now there are no lines, and apples are no longer rotten. So all the countries that transitioned from socialism, communism to capitalism, with all the disadvantages and the buildup of wealth inequality, but all these countries, the standards of all people were lifted up. Never before in the world, overall, in Africa, Latin America, Europe, Central Asia, Far East, and in the United States, have the standards of living been this high.
Oh.
There are wealth inequalities, I agree. But if I'm an economist, I'm looking at policies that boost economic growth and the standards of living of most people. Whereas in socialism, I can tell you, I've been to many countries that previously had free markets and a capitalistic system, and then went into socialism, and it all went down.
Oh, thank you.
If you don't believe me, go and visit Chicago.
Thank you for such timeless insights. You know, a lot of people, and some of them I've hosted on this show, have expressed concern about the long-term sustainability of US government debt and its debt level. In fact, previously there's been that ongoing debate of the debt ceiling in the United States. What specific policies or measures do you believe are necessary to address the issue of debt, sovereign debt? And just across the board, we know that economies all across the world, as we speak, are so highly leveraged. And you know that we know that the US economy and the US dollar plays a pivotal role in the global economy. How do you see the debt issue, not just in the US, but around the world, affecting the global financial markets?
Well, I think this is again a question that would need to write a thesis about debts and the advantages and disadvantages of debt. Everyone has a different idea about that. I personally, I'm against the debt. You understand? I started with nothing. I went to school. I had the privilege to have a good education because it was free in Switzerland. And so I could study and get a PhD, and I had it at 24. And then I went to work. And when I had enough money, I bought a car. And when I had enough money, I bought stocks. And when I had enough money, but I never borrowed money to do these things. It's all out of my savings. Now someone may say, well, Mark, you've been lucky because in the 1970s, when you started to work, I started to work in 1970, assets were inexpensive, whereas now they're expensive. Yes, that is correct. Compared to your income in the 1970s or in the late 60s or even in the early 80s, compared to your income, stocks were cheap and properties were cheap. Now, this is the problem of money printing, that it makes asset prices go up, like real estate, and they become unaffordable. Unaffordable means that a young person who starts to work in a job, he will have great difficulties to buy a house unless he borrows money. He's almost forced by the government to borrow money. And then in some countries, they force people to borrow money through the taxation system, because in some countries you can deduct the interest on your auto loan from your taxes and so forth and so on. So you understand, the government is essentially, to some extent, the one that has encouraged people to go into debts. And of course, the corporate sector, they like debts among people because it boosts economic growth for a while. But then there's a point that comes where the debt becomes a liability. In other words, you understand, now a young guy, he bought the house and the mortgage rate was 1% or 1.5%, and now it's 7% or 6%. Suddenly, he has to pay money. So he has less spending power on other stuff. So that has some advantages in some economic development phases. But in general, I would look at debt as negative if it grows at a higher rate than the economy. Say the economy grows at 5% per annum. Then in my view, the debt level should only grow at 5% per annum. And number two, and this is a very personal view and nobody will agree with me, I think the government shouldn't borrow money. Because the moment they borrow money, they do things that may not be economical. If everyone has to pay tax for the war in Ukraine, and he knows that's the war tax we are paying, there wouldn't be a war, believe me. But if the government can just print money, everybody thinks, oh, it doesn't cost us anything, the government prints money. Yeah, it will cost them in the higher inflation rate.
Oh, thank you.
Inflation is a tax. I want to make this very clear. The inflation arises when the government spends more money than it takes in terms of tax revenues. And I'm very much in favor as an economic free market thinker and the capitalist. I'm very much in favor that the government only spends money that it takes in taxes and nothing else. Then there is responsibility. Otherwise, you have bureaucrats. They will say, okay, what do I care? It's not my money. I spent on this program and spent on that program. It's not my money. It comes from the government. And the government says, oh, it's not my money. It comes from the central bank because they print money.
Thank you for that. You have been known to be a contrarian, and you have bearish views on the global economy and the financial markets. Have there been times when your predictions have been incorrect? And I know you've been in the industry for over 4 decades, and some of the predictions that you've made have had a seismic impact on the global financial markets. And how have you adjusted your investment strategy as a result?
Well, I think if you go through life, you have to say that as humans, we make mistakes every day. The question is to what extent do our mistakes impact other people negatively? So if you're a cobbler or a worker and you make a mistake in your profession, you may affect one customer and so forth. But if you're in a position of a government, of a prime minister, or of a central bank, and you make a mistake, you may affect the lives of, the majority of the population. So I think this is a different way of looking at making mistakes. To what extent, if I'm wrong, do I hurt other people? And to what extent, if I'm wrong, do I only hurt myself, my reputation, and maybe 1 or 2 of my customers? So to the question is, have you ever been wrong? Yes, a lot. But to that, I also want to point out, say we have 5 analysts, and we're looking at one sector, say the banking sector. And one analyst is very negative, and one analyst is very bullish. Okay. We sit there and say, okay, we will look at it in a year's time. So in a year's time, the very bearish analyst is right because the banks went down. And then we can say, oh, this bullish person over there, he's an idiot because he was bullish and bank stocks went down. 2 years later, the banks have rebounded strongly. Then we have to put the finger on the guy who was bearish and say, oh, this idiot, he missed the whole bull market in banks. And he is a hero. He was bullish about banks. You understand? Right and wrong in the financial markets and in asset markets is very much also a question of what is the time horizon? Yes. What is the social conditions? How long do they take to actually take place? I wrote in 1997 a book about the rise and the fall of cities in the context of Hong Kong in 1997, which transferred from the sovereignty of Britain to the sovereignty of China, okay? And I explained that cities that were free originally, like Venice or Augsburg or Tangier, when they went part and became part of a big empire, their importance diminished and their prosperity overall diminished. It, not that they disappeared, but it diminished relative to the rest. And in Hong Kong, for the first 10 years until 2007, the stock market still went up and it made a new high in 2007. But now it becomes obvious that the heydays of Hong Kong as a free city and as the only kind of frontier between China, communist China, and the Western world, it was the bridge where everybody went to as long as China was a communist country. Now, there are many bridges. There are bridges in Shanghai, there are bridges in Xiamen, there are bridges in Nanking, and so forth and so on. So the time frame is important. And many people, they just look at the next hour in terms of stock market. What is the market going to do tomorrow or the day after tomorrow and so forth? And we have to define this. But in general, I would say the one thing I would never have expected in my life when I studied economics in Zurich, in Switzerland, and also at the London School of Economics, where I wrote my PhD, is that we would have central banks that promote negative interest rates. That I never thought. We dealt in economics in a course with a lunatic called Silvio Gesell. He had advocated negative interest rates in the 1920s because he argued that rich people have an advantage and therefore they should be taxed. And the tax would be on their savings, that every year something is taken away. But everybody laughed about him and dismissed him. But these negative interest rates, especially how long they lasted in Europe and in Japan and so forth, that has really surprised me. That I never expected in my life. And I never expected central banks to print so much money as they have in the last 10 years, because I read and studied the economics of high inflation countries, just like here, Economics of Inflation. This is a book that was written about the hyperinflation in Germany in 1918 to 1923. And this hyperinflation, and I've seen it also in Latin America because I used to invest a lot in Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s. This hyperinflation is for a society a disaster. And I would, if I were a central banker, I would do everything. If, say, social advancement and economic prosperity is important to me, I would do everything possible to avoid hyperinflation or high inflation rates. It's very destructive on society. It's very destructive on economic growth, and it creates huge wealth inequalities. I mean, you can see this in Zimbabwe, and you can see this in Turkey and so forth. In very high inflation countries, you have a lot of destitute people, very poor people, and you have immense wealth, immense.
So just to wrap it up, our last question for this interview. You, as we've been discussing here, you're critical of the current global financial system, and you're arguing for greater decentralization and diversification into more tangible wealth. How do you see these changes being implemented, and what role do you believe cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology could play in this grand transformation?
I think that cryptocurrencies is a response of the system towards money printing. You understand? The blockchain technology allows to issue money, but in a very limited way. Now, I'm not discussing all the fraud cases that are floating around. You understand? But say Bitcoin, the supply will one day be increased when you use quantum computers that can recalculate at a much faster rate than is possible today. But in general, I think the way we have been living, I remember my grandmother, when I was born, she opened a savings account for me. And every Christmas and every birthday, she put $50 into the account, which in those days was quite a lot of money. But you went then to the bank, and the bank employee wrote in your savings account by hand 50 francs, and then he added it together to the total. So he calculated the interest. That is gone. We are half into electronic banking already. If I have a credit card, it's like money. Do you understand? I can use my credit card anyway, with one exception. It doesn't work when the internet doesn't work. You need internet for a credit card to work. Because if you go, sometimes you're at the hotel counter and checking out in the morning because you have to catch the flight. And then the receptionist says, "Oh, sorry, our computers are down." And you tell them, "Well, when do they come up?" And they tell you, "Well, we don't really know." And your flight is waiting for you. So you understand? This is I wanted to explain the difference. If you carry a gold coin in your pocket, with that, you can probably always buy something somewhere. With the crypto, you depend on electricity and on the internet. That people should not forget. And we've seen many cases where the government steals the cryptocurrencies away from owners. So it's not as watertight. But in general, I believe that in future, we will not have the dollar system anymore, the clearing arrangements in New York. Let's say, if you make a remittance from England to Hong Kong, or from England to Thailand, where I live in the north of Thailand, in Chiang Mai, and the money goes first to New York, and from New York to the Thai bank. Okay, that will disappear, the clearing arrangement. It will be done directly. but with some advantages and disadvantages. But I think in general, the dollar as a global currency is doomed. I mean, it will disappear. Question, is it tomorrow or in 10 years' time? You know, we don't know these things. But if you look at the size of the US compared to the size of India, compared to the size of Indonesia, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, everything, Africa, then it's a tiny country population-wise. And they will not continue to dominate the world. That is for sure.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
We don't know for how long they may continue, but in the long run, they will not control it.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Marc Faber, for such timeless insights. And
Well,
I look forward to hosting you again on this show. But I'm afraid for now we'll have to call it a day. Thank you so much for being.
Where are you based?
I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, East Africa.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
I've been to Kenya, and I started to invest in Kenyan stocks in 1994. So a long time ago.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to hosting you frequently on this show. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very